there an epidemic of trans violence or violence linked to gender dysphoria? This is a question that many people are asking and debating over, given the recent tragedies that have struck the nation over the past few years, including the most recent tragedy in Minneapolis, where a bunch of Catholic school children were unfortunately the victim of a ravenous madman who shot into their school and killed 2 of them and injured many others. And also in Nashville, where a similar case of a trans shooter going in and killing a bunch of school children also occurred. But I think that a lot of this conversation is focused on the wrong element and instead misses entirely the question of moral identity that is actually central to how things like this happen, how criminality arises, and how depraved acts continue to go unabated in our constant culture of reaction, which discourages more reflection. So, in this video, my friends, I will be addressing this issue. I will be analyzing these events in light of the question of moral identity, and I will be actually exploring the so-called trans violence rate in light of all these facts to hopefully make some sense of it, and also, most importantly, to provide enlightenment to this much-needed discussion. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all are doing well. I am Christian Moss. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message is successful, even if you disagree with me. My friends, this is a civic conservative project. If you believe in the foundational principles that made America what it is and that are important to be pushed into the conversation constantly, and you believe they ought to be pushed with philosophical rigor and historical clarity, and you want to defend America from cultural corrosion and from the forces that seek to tear it down, this is where you need to be. Join this civic conservative project. Join our Discord. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. Donate, do whatever you can to ensure that our content is successful. Thank you guys so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, as I mentioned, there have been many tragedies that have struck the nation over the past few years who have been perpetuated by, indeed, shooters who had a trans identity. Most recently in Minneapolis, as I mentioned, 2 school children were killed and several others were injured. And many families were left with a gaping wound in their heart for those who were lost, and an even bigger question of uncertainty concerning if their children are even safe in these areas. In Nashville, as I mentioned, a bunch of kids also at a religious school, a Christian school, were targeted by another trans shooter. And by the way, I will not be saying the names of these people in the video, just out of respect for those who were slain, and also out of a desire not to mythologize them and immortalize them as they sought to be, as evidenced in their manifestos. They also targeted school children for the goal of sort of attacking a symbol in Nashville that they thought was particularly bad and oppressive. These conversations consistently go towards the question of gender identity, as opposed to going towards something that's actually much more fundamental. I don't mean to entirely eliminate the sort of trans element to all of this, but I do think that it's a conservative distraction if the cause is much deeper. You see, the similarities between the Nashville shooter and the Minneapolis shooter actually are similarities shared by other people that have done other depraved acts, whether it be Ted Kaczynski, who was, of course, the Unabomber, who had a lot of critiques of modern society and thought those critiques justified going ahead and doing acts of terror. Or the Louisville bank shooter, who was an anti-capitalist and also was an anti-Second Amendment person, who thought that shooting up the Louisville bank where he used to work would actually be a way to push people into going for more gun control. Or whatever else, other shooters that have had similar kind of depraved minds. They all share one thing in common, my friends. And that is a disordered conscience. Anyone, my friends, can have a disordered conscience. And a disordered conscience can create, actually does create, a terrible moral identity. And that moral identity leads to habits that are destructive to the person and also destructive to everyone around them. And the fact that the shooters I've mentioned, including the one in Minneapolis, happen to be trans is largely secondary and even downstream of the broader question of moral identity. Very simply, my friends, if you want to think about this sort of question, we can divide it between 2 categories of identity. The question of expressive identity and moral identity. And expressive identity simply is how someone presents themselves to the society. This can be someone being a goth. This could be someone being a chess player. This can be someone being a mountaineer. This can be someone being a hunter. Moral identity, however, are the elements that allow us to operate in society in a way that is not destructive and also in a way that is virtuous, in a way that respects the rules and principles that actually make society possible and actually make the duty-bound man, not just a good man, but a rightfully ordered man. The trans situation, transgenderism, is largely a matter of expressive identity. In fact, in past videos, I've actually provided two ways to think about transgenderism. You can think about it either as a state of being or a condition of being. I think the first way is more proper. A state of being is how you are feeling and how you are disposed of in a particular way, in a particular time. So a state of being may be you are angry, or you are creative, or you are sad, or you are happy. A condition of being is something that is so integral to who you are as a human being that to remove it would be in essence to destroy you. Many people treat transgenderism as a condition of being, and by doing so, they actually treat transgenderism as, I think, in an incorrect way, because transgenderism is merely an expression. It does not change the essence of who you are. It does not make you a man or a woman if you're a woman or if you're a man. It simply is a way you express yourself in relation to how certain ideas are acted out in society. And if you see it that way, it becomes nothing more different than changing a pair of clothes or being a goth or being whatever. It becomes a rather banal and mundane thing. But when those on the sort of gender activist left bring a much bigger significance to transgenderism than it deserves, and by its categorical nature, and those on the right try to pose all the problems of society upon it, or the problems we've seen with these past two shooters that I mentioned on it, we treat the issue in a much bigger light than it ought to be treated. If we look at the rates of gender dysphoria, there is no connection between having gender dysphoria and shooting up a school. But there is a connection between gender dysphoria and other forms of mental illness and sadness and suicidality. Those are the areas and the questions we should focus on when it comes to the issue of trans violence. Is the violence done to the self? When it comes to this issue of people with a disordered conscience hurting other people, the question has to be moral identity, because moral identity is universal to human nature, and moral identity is a much more of an explanatory force than trans identity ever could be. So this gets us into the question of mental illness. The Minneapolis shooter and the Nashville shooter, but I'll focus on the Minneapolis shooter. The Minneapolis shooter had a clear case of mental illness. It is still being decided about what he had exactly, but he had a clear case of mental illness. For example, he was quoted as saying in his manifesto that he wants to be a scary, horrible monster that stands over all of those powerless kids that he eventually would go on to harm. He's also quoted as saying that he hates fascism, and then he also says, quote, "I also love it when kids get shot. I love to see kids get torn apart," end quote. He then also says, and for any of you who may believe that he is some kind of leftist, he's actually just an agent of chaos with no formed ideas. He also says, quote, "They only talk about brown people dying, and I don't care about them. I like to hear when Israelis get killed, but they don't like to report on that stuff," he wrote. "I don't do it to spread a message. I do it to please myself because I am sick." And this shooter is quoted as saying that he was raised with empathy and compassion to be a good person, but he doesn't want to do any of those things because he is sick. Now, this is a kind of dispersion of responsibility, because if you're able to acknowledge what the right thing is, but then you proceed to do the wrong thing, you don't have a kind of just an illness that is stopping you from understanding what's right and wrong, which is what some mental illness does. You have a willful action that is in line with your illness, that embraces it, rather than seeks to subjugate it beneath the sound guide of cool reason. And this is part of the problem, my friends. Mental illness weakens our moral identity by attacking the moral sense. So there are three aspects, my friends, of moral identity. There is the values we hold, there's our conscience, there's our habits. Beneath our conscience is our moral sense. Our moral sense is that thing that all of us have as human beings. You even have it. You watch me, my dear viewer, that tells us what is right and wrong instinctively before it gets to our intellect, before it gets to our reason. Our moral sense would then compel us to instinctively know what is right and wrong, but it sometimes fails. So it's then passed up to the conscience. The conscience holds our reason and holds the principles that essentially establish what is right and wrong: justice, truth, fidelity, loyalty. And it refines our moral sense to be a more active thing. Then that goes towards our habits, which are then a result of a well-ordered conscience. If your moral sense is blunted by mental illness, which is a sort of disruption in how the brain ought to work normally, i.e. a mental illness, your conscience is not going to be able to operate on the best level possible. And this is going to produce disordered behavior. But a healthy moral identity, a healthy moral faculty of conscience, which is encouraged by reflection and moral education, can actually correct the damage that mental illness does to the brain and prevent it from ruining your habits by constantly keeping you in line mentally with what is right, even if there's a tension within yourself. All of us have tensions within ourselves, and in some cases the mental illness are so severe and so terrible that isolation from society is the only acceptable way to deal with it. But many cases are not so terrible, and mere treatment, not just psychological treatment, but also moral treatment, can help blunt the impact that one's potentially destructive behaviors can have on civil society. But our moral identities and our ability to reflect, which is then going to help when we try to be educated about what is right and what is wrong, that is going to be impacted by the society we live in. And right now, my friends, we live in a society of reaction, not a society of reflection. Insects, animals, beasts in the woods can react, and they do react instinctually. What makes man different is that he can take his reactions and refine them into civilization. He can refine them into creativity. He can refine them into associations. He can refine them into producing things that other animals can't quite do in the state of nature. So therefore, our reflection is the faculty that takes out that takes our instinct and makes it something more. But if we have a culture where we are acting in the manner of beasts by reacting, by having hot takes, by literally magnifying the worst examples of things in our culture, by making violence a sensationalized commodity, which the old world media has done so many times, and we use that as our form of sustenance, as our form of consumption, and we forget reflection, we forget the reckoning of the self, we forget the importance of first principles, we forget the importance of natural law, we forget the importance of actually wrestling with our own selves in a way that respects who we are in our forms as human beings, then we're going to have a society that encourages implicitly disordered behavior. And unfortunately, these shooters existed in that kind of society, a society that fed them succor for their sickness. Evil cannot flourish unless it has a host to derive from, because evil is not derivative of man. Evil is an antithesis to man. It feeds off of him. Without a host, it cannot exist. We have a culture that gives evil succor by giving attention to the wrong things and ensuring that people do not actually reflect on what is good for them. And the conservative ought to say, hold on, let me press pause and let me actually look at what's going on and investigate this. And let's create a culture of the heart which discourages bad actions. We don't have that largely right now in the society, and that is precisely why people like Kaczynski and the Minneapolis shooter and the bank shooter in Louisville and the shooter in Nashville feel vindicated in writing manifestos that they can give for our consumption, because they know we'll do what? React to it. And what we will not do, we will not reflect on it. And the cycle, the vicious cycle, continues. Moral responsibility, my friends, is not tied to your expression. Moral responsibility is tied to your moral identity. Because in order for you to be responsible for your actions, you must have a will, and that will must be informed by your higher ordered conscience. And obviously the Minneapolis shooter had a will, understood what his will would cause, even said that he wanted people to pray for the victims after what he did to them was happening. He wanted people to pray for the victims because he knew that the suffering would be coming. The moral responsibility here cannot exist without acknowledging the moral identity. If we were to just say, oh, it's because he's trans and, oh, he's mentally ill, then we absolve evil of the responsibility that we can then use to correct evil. We undermine the moral foundations that allow us to say this is evil, and we ought to stop it, and we ought to reject it with the fullness that any conscionable people should reject and should have. My friends, the issue is not trans identity. The issue is not even mental illness per se. The issue is a lack of moral education, a culture that does not cultivate good habits, and that culture then giving sustenance to those who are disordered in their minds so they can go along and commit the moral evil and then expect a reaction and a result from it. To be mythologized in the minds of the many. This is why the Columbine shooters were so excited and so gleeful, not just because they were sick, because they knew they'd be immortalized. And only in a culture that rejects reflection and rejects a sound moral sense and rejects a healthy conscience can this kind of behavior actually happen. A culture of the heart, my friends. It means a society where our emotions are brought in line, our sentiments are brought in line with our reason. And our sentiments and our reason coexist to create the more harmonious person by recognizing that we're not just led by facts and logic, we're also led by feeling and sensation. And we're not just led by feeling and sensation, but we're also led by reflection. Reflection requires us to have a mind. This culture of the heart, which produces healthy reflections, healthy sentiments, that is harmonious with who you are as a human being, this is what actually is most important. Because if this is actually put in line in the right way, then that means that behaviors that are destructive, behaviors that are wrong, behaviors that go against first principles can be more easily corrected for and amended to before they become the destruction of other people, the destruction of innocent people at the barrel of a gun. One last word. There are a lot of folks that are saying they want to take away the Second Amendment or take away the right to bear arms from mentally ill people because of what happened in Minneapolis. And to that I say this. Principles are meant to be followed, not broken. And the moment you allow a moment or 2 moments or 3 moments to trade your principles, to invalidate your principles, is the moment you admit that you have no principles, you have no ground to stand on, and instead you are guided entirely by the moment. The moment is your standard, not the eternal truth. And the eternal truth is the only thing that we can base society off of, the only thing we can base morality off of. And a retreat from the eternal truth is exactly why situations like this can happen. It's exactly why evil is given the oxygen to blaze like an inferno across a forest. And the opposite, a return to the eternal truth, a return to first principles, a return to a healthy culture of the heart can actually help us fix this issue before it continues to go on and before it gets out of control even more than it already is. My friends, moral identity, not trans identity, is the issue here, and we ought to, as conservatives, as Americans, address this, and we ought to address it fruitfully. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Join the Pensive cohort, a cohort of thinkers that are going to push forth civic conservatism into the public sphere. Also, my friends, be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. Donate to me as well if you so wish. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please, my friends, stay pensive. Bye-bye, everyone.